The light slowly faded outside the window, plunging the surroundings into a gloomy darkness. Derek sat in the kitchen, holding an axe in his hand and staring at an empty whiskey bottle. His head was spinning, his ears were ringing, but his gaze was sharp, like the blade he held. His eyes were fixed on the darkness outside the window, where the forest began. The voices in his head would not stop, and he heard them more and more clearly. They were not just thoughts but malicious whispers knocking on his mind, instilling fear and hatred. In this silence he heard something else. Footsteps. A scraping sound. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was his imagination. But Derek knew it was something else, something dark and evil that dwelled in these woods and had now come for him. He stood up, feeling the floor creak beneath his feet, and walked to the door. The axe in his hand felt heavy but familiar, like an old friend. He opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The darkness embraced him, but he was not afraid of it. He stepped onto the soft grass water from the lake spread beneath his feet, but he didn't care. He knew what he had to do. Alfie, his only friend, his little companion, was waiting for him somewhere out there in the woods. And he would find him. Derek walked along a familiar path winding through the dense trees, listening to every sound. The forest was dark and silent, as if all its inhabitants had abandoned it, leaving only darkness and stillness. There was no wind, but the leaves on the trees trembled as if in hidden fear. Derek knew someone was there. He felt it in his very being. Someone was watching him. His steps quickened, his heart pounding in his chest as he reached a small clearing. Here, he stopped, trying to gather his thoughts. The moon peeked out from behind the clouds, illuminating the clearing with a silver light. He saw it. A man stood before him, but not quite a man. The creature wore Eileen's dress, torn and dirty, its hair hanging in tufts, its face hidden in shadow. Its eyes glinted in the darkness, sinister and empty. Derek raised the axe, his hands trembling, but he did not back down. "Where is he?" Derek shouted, stepping forward. "Where's Alfie?" The creature smiled, its smile wide and unnatural, like that of a corpse. It didn't say a word but turned and began to move deeper into the forest. Derek followed it, carefully stepping on the wet ground. The creature led him to an old, abandoned mill, hidden deep in the woods. Derek remembered this place from his childhood. The mill had stood here for centuries, abandoned and forgotten like a ghost of the past. Derek froze before the old building, listening to the silence around him. The creature entered, its silhouette disappearing in the darkness of the doorway. Derek took a deep breath and followed. Inside the mill, it was dark. The air smelled of mold and decay. He turned on a flashlight, illuminating the old machinery and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. Weak moonlight penetrated through cracks in the walls, casting strange shadows. Derek moved slowly, keeping the axe ready. He heard rustling, quiet sounds, as if someone was gliding through the shadows, watching him. Suddenly, he heard a faint whimper. Alfie. Derek's heart skipped a beat, and he moved towards the sound, peering into the darkness. His gaze stopped in the corner of the room, where Alfie lay, tied up and trembling. "Alfie!" Derek shouted, rushing to him. He fell to his knees and began untying the ropes, freeing his friend. Alfie was alive but scared and weak. Derek lifted him into his arms, holding him close. But when he looked up, the creature stood right in front of him. It moved toward him, extending its arms. Derek stepped back, raising the axe, ready to fight. The creature made a low, guttural sound, as if laughing, and lunged forward. Derek swung the axe, striking. The blade sank into flesh, but the creature did not stop. It hit him with such force that Derek flew back, hitting the wall. The flashlight flew from his hand, rolling across the floor. Derek felt blood trickling down his face, but he got up, gripping the axe. The creature slowly approached, its eyes glowing in the dark. Derek took a step forward, ready for the final confrontation. He knew he couldn't leave. He knew he couldn't save himself, but he could save Alfie. Gathering all his strength, he charged at the creature. The axe gleamed in the moonlight as he struck blow after blow. The creature screamed, writhing and twisting, but it did not back down. It hit him again and again and again. Finally, Derek fell to his knees, exhausted and bleeding. The creature stood over him, its eyes glowing in the dark. It looked at him with hatred and hunger. Derek looked up into those bottomless eyes and realized it was the end. But he wasn't afraid. He knew he had done everything he could. He had saved his friend. And that was enough. The creature leaned over him, its cold fingers tightening around his throat. Derek closed his eyes, bracing for the final blow. And at that moment, he heard a faint but distinct sound. Barking. Alfie. He was here nearby. Derek opened his eyes, looking at his friend. He saw him standing in the doorway, the moonlight illuminating his small body. Alfie wasn't running away, wasn't hiding. He was here, ready to fight for his master. The creature froze, its gaze turning to the dog. Derek felt its fingers loosen, and he struggled to raise the axe. One last blow. One last chance. He summoned all his strength and struck. The axe blade sank into the creature's neck, piercing through. It let out a scream, full of pain and anger, and collapsed to the floor. Derek remained on his knees, staring at the dead body before him. He heard Alfie run up to him, felt his warm body by his leg. He survived. They both survived. When the first rays of the sun began to break through the trees, Derek sat by the old mill, holding Alfie in his arms. He watched as the light bathed the forest, turning night into day. He knew it was over. He knew he would never see that creature again. It was gone for good. But Derek knew the forest would not forget. The forest remembered. It always remembers. And he knew that someday, in another time, on another night, the darkness would return. But he wasn't afraid of it. Because now he knew he had a friend. A small but brave friend who would always be there. And that was enough. Derek stood, feeling the light penetrate his soul, filling it with warmth. He looked at Alfie and smiled. "Let's go home, buddy," he said, rising to his feet and slipping the axe back into his belt. Alfie looked up at him, wagging his tail, his eyes shining with joy that it was finally over. Derek knew there was still much to go through, but now he was full of determination and strength. As they walked through the forest, the morning light gradually filled the dark corners, and the mist slowly dissipated. Everything seemed the same as always, but for Derek, this forest was no longer the same. He had witnessed something beyond logic or understanding, and it had left an indelible mark on his soul. With each step, he felt the weariness weighing down on him more and more, but there was a sense of satisfaction in his chest. Alfie walked beside him, his little paws pattering on the wet ground, leaving tiny footprints. Derek looked at his friend and knew he would never let anything bad happen to him again. No one and nothing would take away the last piece of his former life. When they reached the house, the sun was already high in the sky, illuminating the old wooden cabin. Derek stopped at the doorstep, looking around. Everything was just as he had left it, the door wide open, wet footprints on the floor, a broken flashlight lying by the wall. He sighed softly, feeling his eyes start to sting with tears. He wiped them away with his sleeve and stepped inside. Derek led Alfie to the bathroom to wash away the dirt and blood accumulated over this horrific night. The dog patiently sat in the tub, and the warm water washed away all traces of recent events. Derek bathed him silently, thinking about what to do next. He knew the police wouldn't believe him. No one would. They would think he was crazy, or maybe even dangerous. But he didn't care anymore about what others thought. He had seen what he had seen, and he knew it was real. Once Alfie was clean and dry, they both headed to the kitchen. Derek poured himself a strong cup of coffee, feeling his strength slowly returning. Alfie settled at his feet, occasionally glancing up at his owner. Derek didn't know what would happen next, but he was determined to figure out what had happened. He pulled out an old notebook that once belonged to his father and began to write. He described everything that had happened, every detail, every feeling. He knew it was important, even if no one ever read these notes. He wanted there to be a record for someone to know the truth when he was gone. Life returned to its usual rhythm. Derek took care of his home, worked at the lumberyard, took care of Alfie.
But the shadows of the past did not leave him. At night, he was plagued by nightmares. He would see the creature again, hear its raspy breathing, and feel its cold hands around his neck. He would wake up covered in sweat and find it hard to fall back asleep. One morning, as he stepped out onto the porch for his coffee, he noticed something strange at the edge of the forest. He squinted, trying to see better. Among the trees there was something white. He grabbed the binoculars hanging on a hook by the door and focused them on the forest. It was Eileen's dress, fluttering in the wind, pinned to a tree. Derek flinched, his heart racing. Someone had been here. Someone was watching him. He lowered the binoculars, trying to calm himself. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe animals had carried it there. But something deep inside told him it wasn't that simple. He set the binoculars down and took a sip of his coffee, trying not to panic. He didn't know what it meant, but one thing was clear: the darkness had not gone away forever. It would return. And when it did, he would be ready. Years passed. Derek grew older, his hair turned gray, and deep wrinkles marred his face. Alfie was gone, but Derek had not gotten in their dog. He lived alone, rarely leaving the house, and almost never interacted with anyone. The forest around him seemed alive. And he knew the darkness was still there, hiding in the shadows of the trees. One night, as he sat by the fireplace reading an old book, he heard a sound outside the window. Footsteps. He set the book aside and got up to approach the window. Outside it was dark, but he saw a silhouette. A figure dressed in a white dress stood at the edge of the forest. It did not move, just stood there, watching the house. Derek felt his heart tighten in his chest. He took the axe he always kept nearby and stepped out onto the porch. The figure did not move, but Derek knew it was waiting for him. He knew it was time to face the darkness again. He took a step forward, then another. The moon shone brightly, illuminating his path. The darkness waited for him, and he walked towards it.